Welcome back. Tonight, we're gently stepping into the quiet halls and secret archives hidden deep within Vatican walls. Over centuries, the Vatican has carefully guarded a collection of documents that few ever see. The mysterious Exorcist Files, filled with accounts of spiritual warfare, whispered prayers, and unseen battles fought beneath Rome's ancient streets. These records hold secrets both beautiful and unsettling. But don't be misled by the grandeur of Rome or the stillness of its sacred spaces. Behind the marble facades lies darkness, often confronted in silence. Before we uncover these hidden truths, remember to like and subscribe, but only if you find comfort and curiosity in the stories we share. And please leave a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I truly enjoy hearing from our quiet global community. Now, dim your lights, settle in comfortably, and join me as we uncover mysteries long hidden in shadows. There are places inside the Vatican no tourist will ever see. Past the museums and grand halls, deeper than the catacombs that hold saints and martyrs, lies a quiet wing known only to a select few. Within it are rooms lined with stone and silence, each one locked behind heavy doors without names. Among these is a chamber not listed on any official floor plan, dimly lit and rarely entered. It contains no treasure, no holy relic, only records, thousands of them, bound in leather, sealed in dust. These are the Exorcist Files. Testimonies written in the trembling hands of priests, signed in haste, sometimes stained with wax or something darker. The Church does not advertise their existence, and yet they endure, tucked among forgotten corridors where the only visitors are those with clearance and caution. The Church has long held a complex relationship with evil. Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, the faithful believed that demonic possession was a real threat, a spiritual invasion that required divine intervention. By the 4th century, Saint Athanasius wrote of monks in Egypt confronting evil spirits in the desert. Saint Augustine warned that demons were not mere metaphor, but cunning, invisible enemies. As the Church grew in power, so did its need to codify and contain its approach to such phenomena. By the time of the Carolingian Renaissance in the 9th century, specific prayers and rites had begun to take form, passed among bishops and abbots as both shield and sword. The Vatican's official rite of exorcism, or Rituale Romanum, was first compiled under Pope Paul V in 1614. It laid out the procedures with clarity and caution, warning that most cases were not possession at all, but illness, hysteria, or deceit. But for those rare cases that met the criteria, when a subject recoiled at sacred objects, spoke languages they never learned, or levitated in defiance of gravity, the rite was enacted, and the records were written. In that hidden chamber, each file whispers the same message. Not everything is superstition. Some things resisted explanation. Others refused to die quietly, and so the Church kept notes, not to boast, but to remember. Because in the shadows of its own sanctuaries, it faced things the daylight could not explain. Long before the Vatican formalized its rituals, exorcism was already embedded in the Church's earliest traditions. One of the first recorded instances appears in the writings of Saint Irenaeus, a bishop of Lyon in the 2nd century. In his texts, he describes Christians casting out demons not with elaborate rites or sacred tools, but with the authority of Christ's name alone. This was a time when Christianity was still outlawed in the Roman Empire, when followers met in underground chambers, and faith was carried in whispers, not pageantry. Yet among these early believers, stories of possession and deliverance circulated with urgency. The possessed were not only feared, they were seen as evidence that a battle was being waged for the soul of humanity. The Gospel accounts that predate Irenaeus are even more striking. In the Gospel of Mark, widely considered the earliest written Gospel, Jesus' first miracle is not healing or preaching, but casting out an unclean spirit in a synagogue in Capernaum. The spirit shrieks and resists, but ultimately obeys. This act, confronting evil directly, not metaphorically, became foundational for the early Church. It signaled that spiritual darkness was real, and more importantly, that it could be overcome. As the apostles spread across the Roman world, the stories of exorcism traveled with them. By the 3rd century, church fathers like Tertullian and Origen referenced demonic activity regularly, framing it as both proof of the Christian faith and a reminder of its dangers. But these exorcisms were not public spectacles. They were quiet, private confrontations. Often they were performed by bishops or monks, not before crowds but in small rooms with prayer, fasting, and oil. There was no official ritual yet, no centralized oversight, just the weight of Scripture, the courage of the priest, and the belief that something unseen was trying to take hold of the human body. These early accounts, sparse and fragmented as they are, reveal a church already wrestling with darkness, not only in doctrine, but in flesh. By the early 17th century, centuries of scattered practices and oral traditions were gathered, refined, and inscribed into a single solemn ritual. It was during the Counter-Reformation, a time when the Catholic Church sought to reinforce its spiritual authority, that Pope Paul V authorized the publication of the Rituale Romanum in 1614. Among its many rites for blessings, baptisms, and funerals, it included an official framework for exorcism, De exorcizandis obsessis a demonio, or on the expulsion of demons from the possessed. This marked the first time the Church had a standardized method for confronting possession, a liturgy drawn from Scripture, tradition, and centuries of hard-won experience. It did not promise power to the exorcist. Instead, it was carefully constructed to remind the priest that he acted only as an instrument, that the authority came not from him, but from Christ alone. The ritual itself is not theatrical. It is, in fact, austere and methodical. It begins with a careful inquiry, one that demands spiritual and psychological discernment. The Church has long warned that most signs of possession, convulsions, voices, visions may stem from mental illness or manipulation. Only after exhaustive evaluation by both physicians and clergy is the rite permitted. When approved, the exorcist begins with litanies, psalms, and the invocation of saints. Holy water is used to sanctify the space. A crucifix is held high. Then in Latin, the ancient words are spoken. Exorcizo te immundicime spiritus. I exorcise you, unclean spirit. The command is not delivered in rage, but in unwavering calm. Authority lies in the quiet repetition, the invocation of divine names, the trust that truth can withstand any scream. What is most striking is the solemnity of it all. The rite was never designed to perform miracles for crowds. It is a private battle, fought in the dim corners of chapels or quiet homes, where the possessed tremble and the priest often leaves exhausted. No two cases are alike. Some end in hours, others stretch for weeks, even years. But in every case, the rite stands as the Church's last resort, a declaration that the soul is not yet lost. It is not spectacle, it is defiance. In the late Middle Ages, the city of Avignon became the unlikely backdrop for one of the Church's most disturbing cases of possession. During the Avignon papacy in the 14th century, when the papal seat had temporarily moved from Rome to southern France, Avignon was a city swollen with clerical power, wealth, and unrest. The year was 1333 when reports began circulating of a young woman from a local convent who had fallen into violent, erratic fits. Her name was not preserved in the surviving texts, only that she was of noble birth and had entered the cloister as part of her family's devotion. At first, her affliction was believed to be a kind of spiritual melancholy, a condition often described in medieval theology as demonic sadness. But soon, her condition worsened. She began speaking in voices not her own, deep, guttural, and filled with contempt. She uttered blasphemies in Latin, a language she had never been taught. The case reached the ears of Pope John XV, who at that time resided in Avignon and had already established a reputation for his interest in spiritual phenomena, both divine and demonic. The Pope dispatched a team of Dominican friars, known for their theological rigor and knowledge of exorcism, to investigate. What they found disturbed them. Witnesses claimed the woman levitated during night prayers. She refused to eat blessed bread. Her skin burned when touched by relics. The friars began the rite immediately, but the process stretched on for weeks. During one particularly violent session, the demon reportedly spoke, identifying itself by name, an ancient one associated with chaos in early Christian demonology. The priests, trained in confronting lies and misdirection, intensified their prayers. They read from psalms. They invoked Saint Michael, They fasted and waited. The final session was said to have occurred during the Feast of the Assumption, with the bishop present and a crowd gathered outside the convent walls. The exorcist completed the rite. The woman collapsed, weeping, whispering that the voices were gone. She never relapsed. The official records filed with the diocesan office were stored securely, but rumors spread quickly. Avignon was a city filled with whispers, and this possession became a silent legend among its clergy, a reminder that even in a seat of papal power, darkness found its way in. Long before the Renaissance, when Europe still clung to the shadows of forgotten knowledge, there reigned a pope whose life would be wrapped in myth, suspicion, and whispers of the occult. Gerbert of Aurillac, who became Pope Sylvester II in the year 999, was no ordinary churchman. Born in the Frankish kingdom around 946, he was a scholar trained in mathematics, astronomy, and what was then known as natural philosophy. Unlike most of his peers, Gerbert studied in Muslim Spain, where he encountered advanced sciences, ancient texts, and devices unknown in the Christian world. When he returned north, he brought with him a reputation for brilliance and unease. Some called him a sorcerer. Others whispered that he consorted with demons to gain his knowledge. As Pope, Sylvester II was a reformer. He sought to curb corruption, reassert spiritual discipline, and strengthen papal influence. But the strange stories persisted. After his death in 1003, legends sprang up that he had built an automaton, an artificial head that answered questions with unerring accuracy. Chroniclers in later centuries claimed he had forged a pact with the devil, sealed in a Spanish cave, in exchange for knowledge and power. These tales were not told as fables. They circulated in monastic manuscripts and were copied by scribes who believed them to be plausible. In the medieval mind, where science and magic still blurred, a man of vast learning was viewed with suspicion, and a pope with such knowledge, well, that was a danger to both heaven and hell. Centuries later, the Vatican reviewed these legends with quiet embarrassment, dismissing them as medieval superstition. But the fact that the stories survived at all is telling. Within the Church, Sylvester II became a cautionary tale, a reminder that intellectual ambition without humility can invite something darker. No exorcism was ever recorded in connection with him, but the files note his name more than once, not as possessed, but as suspected. In later demonological texts from the 15th century, his name appears alongside conjurers and heretics. To some, he was a sainted genius. To others, the first occult pope. His tomb lies in the Lateran Basilica, but even there old legends linger. It is said that his bones rattle when the death of another pope is near. In the year 1632, the quiet French town of Loudun became the stage for one of the most sensational and politically charged possession cases in church history. At the heart of the chaos stood a convent of Ursuline nuns who began exhibiting signs of supposed demonic affliction. Their bodies convulsed without cause. Their voices changed, and they accused a local priest, Father Urbain Grandier, of having summoned the devil to torment them. The case rapidly escalated beyond the boundaries of faith and healing. What began as spiritual disorder soon unraveled into a storm of scandal, torture, and execution, all unfolding under the gaze of church and crown alike. Father Grandier had already earned the hostility of many in Loudun. He was intelligent, defiant, and vocal in his opposition to Cardinal Richelieu's policies. He had powerful enemies in both the clerical and political spheres. When the accusations arose, they were seized upon with urgency. A commission was dispatched to investigate, and among them were church officials trained in exorcism. What they encountered was both unsettling and suspect. The nuns, especially the prioress, claimed they were plagued by spirits and tormented at night by invisible forces. During public exorcisms, they writhed, spoke in tongues, and convulsed with apparent agony. Yet even in the spectacle, some questioned the authenticity of their suffering. Were they truly possessed or swept into hysteria by pressure, suggestion, and fear? Despite these doubts, the church and state proceeded with grave conviction. Grandier was arrested, interrogated, and ultimately subjected to torture. Under duress, a supposed pact was found, a document allegedly written in blood and signed by demonic princes, detailing his alliance with the devil. The trial was a grim performance, and the outcome predetermined. In 1634, Grandier was burned alive in the town square, professing his innocence to the last breath. The possessions did not cease immediately. In fact, they intensified, as if the ritual had only fanned the fire. But in time, the nuns returned to silence, and the case faded from public view. The Vatican kept its distance, later treating the Loudun affair as a lesson in caution. It remains a stain on ecclesiastical history, a moment when exorcism became theater and belief was used as a blade. The Exorcist Files mention it sparingly, but the tragedy lingers like ash. There are names the Vatican does not publish, men whose assignments are never listed and whose travel records leave no trace. Among them was a priest whose work remained unknown for most of his life, except within the sealed ledgers of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. His real name was never disclosed publicly, but within internal correspondence, he was referred to only as Padre N. He was born in southern Italy in the early 20th century, ordained before the Second World War, and quietly trained in Rome by one of the church's senior exorcists. What made him different was not his piety but his precision. Vatican officials described him as unnervingly calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not flinch, but he went where others would not, remote villages, crumbling hospitals, and occasionally into the homes of the clergy themselves. Unlike more well-known exorcists, Padre N left no public sermons or interviews. His work was entirely pastoral, done in secret, and often requested by bishops who feared scandal. One case, documented in the archives under a numerical code, tells of a possession in Palermo in 1958. The victim was a young seminarian who had begun having episodes of violent speech and prophetic visions. Local priests believed it to be stress or madness, but when he began speaking in Aramaic and recoiling from consecrated bread, Rome was notified. Padre N arrived without entourage or announcement. Within 2 days, the disturbances ceased. Witnesses later claimed that the exorcist never raised his voice once, he simply prayed. It is believed that over the course of 4 decades, he performed more than 70 formal exorcisms, nearly all of them undocumented to the public. Some of his reports remain locked under Vatican authority, sealed due to what officials have called pastoral sensitivity. The only clue to his identity is a single obituary published in a provincial paper in 1987, noting the passing of a retired diocesan priest and spiritual advisor to Rome. The name is generic, the location vague, but among Vatican insiders his reputation endures. He was the one they called when everything else failed. Not a figure of fame or myth, but a man who walked into darkness and did not speak of it afterward. Not all papal legacies are written in encyclicals or diplomatic victories. Some are whispered in prayer, quietly repeated in moments of fear. Pope Leo XIII, who reigned from 1878 to 1903, is best remembered for his intellect and political diplomacy. He was a man of letters, a philosopher pope who sought to guide the Church into the modern age. Yet within the Vatican, Leo is remembered for something else, something darker. Near the end of his life, he experienced what many have called a vision, or perhaps a warning. It was not recorded officially at first, but spoken of in cautious tones by those who served him. On a morning in 1884, after celebrating Mass, Leo collapsed briefly and then rose, pale and shaken. When asked what had happened, he reportedly replied that he had heard a conversation between Christ and Satan, an exchange in which the devil requested more power and time to destroy the Church from within. The account was never formally declared doctrine. It was written down in the private notes of those present, but the story spread quickly among the clergy. What is certain is that within days, Pope Leo composed a prayer, a short, direct plea for protection. The prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel was soon added to the end of every low Mass. It was a declaration of spiritual warfare, imploring the Archangel to defend us in battle, and to cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. This was not symbolic language. To Leo, the threat was real. The prayer itself remained in liturgical use until 1964, when reforms of the Second Vatican Council removed it from the standard Mass. Still, many priests continued to recite it privately, especially exorcists. Some within the Vatican believed that Leo's vision had marked the beginning of a slow internal battle, one that would not be fought in public. Others dismissed it as the dream of an aging pope stirred by stress and illness. But among exorcists, his name is invoked with respect. His prayer remains a shield, and in certain rare cases, it is still the first line spoken when the rite begins, not as a ritual, but as a memory of a man who heard something none of us were meant to hear. Beneath the splendor of Rome's basilicas, past the polished altars and gilded ceilings, there are places where silence lingers too long. Not every church in the eternal city is filled only with light. For centuries, priests and caretakers have quietly spoken of unexplainable events within these sacred spaces, of footsteps in locked sacristies, candles that relight themselves, cold draughts in still air. Most dismiss such things as tricks of the mind, the echoes of ancient stone. But some stories are harder to explain. They are not theatrical. They are not told to tourists. They are recorded in private journals, tucked away in chancery offices and whispered during confession. And sometimes they reach the Vatican. One of the oldest cases on file dates back to the 18th century in the Basilica of San Clemente, built atop layers of older churches and pagan temples. A young priest assigned to night watch reported a series of disturbing phenomena over several months. He described hearing Latin chants coming from the crypts, voices he could not trace, often responding in antiphon to his own whispered prayers. More unsettling was the altar stone, which he found slightly displaced each morning, despite locking the sanctuary doors himself. After weeks of sleeplessness and anxiety, he submitted a report to his superior, who quietly passed it to the office of the Inquisition. No formal action was taken. The priest was reassigned, but the account remains in the archives, filed under spiritual disturbance. Another more recent case took place in the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, where a caretaker in the 1960s refused to work after dark. He claimed that a statue of Saint Catherine would weep small drops of moisture each night, only to be dry by morning. Technicians examined the marble. No defect was found. Exorcists were dispatched discreetly, not to banish a demon, but to bless the space and calm the growing fear among clergy. The events subsided. Nothing further was documented. Nothing. The Vatican rarely intervenes unless the phenomena escalate. But in Rome, where churches are built atop ruins and ruins atop graves, some places carry more than history. They carry memory, and sometimes memory behaves like something alive. When most people imagine an exorcism, they see a crucifix, holy water, and a trembling voice reciting Latin in dim candlelight. But the actual tools of a Vatican-trained exorcist are more varied and specific than most realize. These are not magical instruments. They are not relics of superstition. Each object used in the rite has been chosen for its theological meaning, its scriptural grounding, and the tradition it carries. Exorcists are not permitted to improvise. They must work with care, precision, and humility. The rite is a discipline as much as it is a prayer, and the items they carry reflect that quiet seriousness. The most central object is the Rituale Romanum itself, the 1614 manual that contains the liturgy of exorcism. Often, it is not a printed book, but a worn leather volume, pages stained with age and use, sometimes annotated by previous generations of exorcists. Next is the crucifix, not merely a symbol, but a declaration. It is held forward not as a threat, but as a reminder, both to the demon and to the afflicted, of the victory already won. Holy water is used to cleanse the space and the person, blessed according to a specific formula that includes exorcised salt. The salt is added with care, sometimes sprinkled around the room or placed discreetly beneath a chair. It is a mark of purity, a boundary line no spirit may cross. There are also relics, though not every exorcist uses them. A fragment of bone from a recognized saint, typically sealed in a reliquary, is believed to carry spiritual weight. Some exorcists carry medals of Saint Benedict, engraved with Latin inscriptions meant to ward off evil. And always there is the Bible, not just as a text, but as a living weapon. Passages are read aloud, especially from the Gospels, chosen for their power and their precedent. It is not uncommon for the possessed to recoil at certain verses, even before they are spoken. The presence of these objects does not guarantee success. They are not talismans. But in the hands of a faithful priest, each one becomes part of a quiet, methodical resistance. The Church does not romanticize this work. It trains its exorcists to be doctors of the soul, not warriors of spectacle. And when they prepare to face what lies waiting in the shadows, they carry with them not only tools, but trust. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, once called the Secret Archive, contains more than 35,000 volumes stretching over 12 centuries. Most of these are letters, papal bulls, and diplomatic records, dry by nature, protected by the weight of time. But tucked among them, in folders rarely requested and even less frequently discussed, are reports that stray from the administrative. They speak of strange occurrences, private fears, and unexplained phenomena experienced by archivists, scribes, and scholars, working within the quiet labyrinth of the archive itself. These are not formal declarations of exorcism. They are anomalies, written down by men trained to be precise, not fanciful, and that makes them more troubling. In the early 1920s, an assistant archivist working near the section reserved for Inquisition records wrote a memorandum to his superior. He had been alone one evening, cataloging 16th century correspondence from Spain, when he reported feeling a sudden pressure in the room, as if the air had thickened. He described hearing a low whisper, not speech exactly, but a pattern, like breath passing over syllables. When he turned, he saw nothing. But when he returned the next morning, the documents he had carefully stacked were scattered across the floor. He was not reprimanded. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to a different wing. The incident was noted, filed, and never mentioned again. Another case occurred in 1976. When a Jesuit historian working with letters from Pope Gregory IX documented a series of nights in which he felt watched. He had grown uneasy in one particular alcove, located adjacent to a sealed section containing the trial records of suspected heretics. After a week of restless work, he left a note tucked into the file itself, expressing concern that something hostile lingers here. That note is still preserved. No official inquiry followed, but a few months later that wing was closed for renovations, and the historian never returned. The Vatican does not claim that the archive is haunted. It is a repository of faith and history, not folklore. But within its walls are the echoes of judgment, secrecy, and sorrow. Some believe that when memory is sealed too tightly, it does not rest. It waits. In 1976, a young woman named Anneliese Michel died in her family's home in Klingenberg, West Germany. She was 23 years old, emaciated, bruised, and bearing a history of deep psychological and spiritual torment. Her case would become one of the most controversial exorcism trials in modern history, and although it took place far from Rome, the Vatican followed it closely, not because it sanctioned what happened, but because it quietly feared what it revealed. A collision between ancient ritual and modern medicine, between belief and suffering, where no side emerged untouched. Anneliese had been raised Catholic and was deeply devout. At 16, she began experiencing seizures and hallucinations, diagnosed initially as temporal lobe epilepsy. She was prescribed medication, but over the next few years, her symptoms escalated. She claimed to see demonic faces, heard voices condemning her to hell, and could no longer tolerate religious images or consecrated spaces. Multiple doctors and psychiatrists treated her. Still, her condition worsened, and eventually her family, convinced that something beyond the physical was at work, turned to the church. After several failed attempts to obtain approval, 2 local priests, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt, were quietly authorized by the bishop to perform the rite. Between 1975 and 1976, they conducted 67 sessions, many of them recorded on cassette tape. The tapes remain among the most disturbing pieces of exorcism documentation known. Anneliese's voice changes dramatically. She speaks of multiple spirits inside her, including Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, and even Cain. She growls, mocks, and cries out in pain. But she also prays, begs for mercy, and insists that she is offering herself as a sacrifice for the sins of youth and the apostasy of priests. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. She refused food. Her body weakened. On July 1st, 1976, she died. The autopsy revealed malnutrition and dehydration, and her parents and the priests were later tried and convicted of negligent homicide. The Vatican has never formally spoken on the case. It neither condemned nor canonized her, but it quietly ensured that the tapes and transcripts were archived and studied. Some exorcists view her as a victim of illness, others as a soul overwhelmed by forces far more ancient than science can grasp. Either way, her story endures, not because of the horror, but because of the questions it refuses to answer. Most popes preside over the Church's spiritual affairs from a distance, issuing decrees, guiding doctrine, and rarely involving themselves in the intimate, messy work of spiritual intervention. But there have been rare exceptions. Among them was Pope John Paul II, a man known for his public charisma, theological firmness, and tireless travel. Yet, beneath the surface of his papacy lay a quiet conviction that evil was not only institutional or symbolic, but personal and real. Though he never publicized it, John Paul II personally performed exorcisms, breaking a long-standing expectation that such work be left to appointed priests. The records of these encounters are sparse but verified, confirmed by eyewitnesses and Vatican staff who were present at the time. One of the most well-documented instances occurred on March 27, 1982, in a small room within the Vatican. A young woman had been brought to Rome by her family after years of unexplained convulsions, violent speech, and resistance to religious objects. She had already been examined by doctors and declared psychologically unstable, but her family insisted she showed signs that exceeded medical explanation. The Vatican arranged for her to attend a general audience with the Pope, but during the event she began screaming and writhing, disrupting the gathered crowd. Security escorted her to a private space. There, in the presence of cardinals and aides, John Paul II approached her, placed his hands on her head, and prayed. Witnesses later testified that the woman calmed instantly, her expression changing as if something had released its grip. She was seen weeping, not from fear, but from relief. No full rite was performed, only a brief but firm invocation. The moment passed quietly. The Pope returned to his schedule. The Vatican made no statement, but the story did not vanish. It spread through church channels, becoming a point of reflection among exorcists and theologians. It was not the first time he had done so, nor would it be the last. To John Paul II, evil was not merely a theological abstraction. He had lived through totalitarianism, war, and the attempted assassination that nearly killed him in 1981. He believed evil wore many faces, and when it manifested in the cries of the tormented, he did not look away. He stepped forward and spoke the name of Christ, not as pontiff, but as priest. In a world increasingly shaped by science, psychology, and skepticism, the role of the exorcist has become more complex than ever. The Vatican does not dismiss the advances of medicine or deny the importance of mental health. In fact, it requires that all cases of alleged possession be evaluated by medical professionals before an exorcist is even consulted. But despite technological progress and therapeutic breakthroughs, reports of demonic possession continue to reach dioceses around the globe, many dismissed, but some that resist explanation. In response, the Church has not stepped away from the rite. Instead, it has refined and expanded its training, establishing formal programs to educate a new generation of exorcists on how to navigate the modern world. In 1994, the Vatican formally revised the rite of exorcism for the first time since 1614. The new version, published in 1999 as De Exorcismis et Supplicationibus Quibus Dam, streamlined language, emphasized discernment, and allowed for vernacular translations. It was not a break from tradition, but a modernization. The Church sought to ensure that the rite could be performed with dignity, theological clarity, and pastoral sensitivity. Gone were the unnecessarily theatrical phrases. In their place was a more deliberate, prayerful structure. less dramatic, but no less serious. The older rite, however, was never abolished. Priests may still use it with permission, and many experienced exorcists continue to prefer it, believing its language carries a weight and rhythm lost in the revised text. At the same time, the Church quietly began expanding its training. In Rome, the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum hosts an annual course on exorcism and prayer of liberation. Attendees include not just clergy, but lay people, doctors, and psychologists, those on the front lines of distinguishing spiritual affliction from psychiatric crisis. The course is intense, sobering, and always guarded. No recordings are permitted. The cases discussed are real. The Vatican understands the danger of overstatement. It warns against sensationalism and condemns those who treat exorcism as spectacle. But it also maintains that evil in its most invasive form has not vanished. It has simply changed its mask. In an age of technology and doubt, the work of the exorcist continues, not loudly, but persistently, always watching, always listening. Deep in the restricted vaults of the Vatican Library are books few have ever touched. Their spines are cracked, their covers worn, and their contents often veiled in arcane symbols, untranslated languages, and theological warnings. These are the grimoires, texts on magic, demonology, and rituals considered too dangerous for common study. The Church has never denied their existence, though it seldom speaks of them publicly. Some were confiscated during inquisitions. Others were donated by scholars who feared their influence. A few were written by clerics themselves who walked too close to forbidden knowledge. The Vatican does not preserve them to use them. It preserves them to contain them. Among the most infamous is the Ars Goetia, a 17th century manuscript that catalogues 72 demons, each with a name, symbol, and instructions for summoning. The book claims to derive from King Solomon himself, though historians know this to be legend. What troubles church scholars is not the outlandishness of the claims, but their consistency. Many of the names listed appear again and again across different cultures and languages, as if whispered from the same source. Another text, the Picatrix, translated from Arabic in the Middle Ages, is less a manual of evil and more a book of planetary invocations and astrological correspondences. Yet its influence on European occultism was profound, and the Church placed it on the index of forbidden books for centuries. Some grimoires are written in cipher, intelligible only to the initiated. One such codex, held in a climate-controlled chamber under Vatican protection, is believed to be the Liber Tenebrarum, the Book of Shadows, once confiscated from a noble family in northern Italy. Though never officially acknowledged, its entries reportedly include rituals meant to invite spirits into the body under the guise of saints. Such deceptions, the Church teaches, are how evil enters most easily, by appearing as something familiar, even holy. The exorcist is not trained to use these books, but he is taught to recognize their patterns, to know the symbols carved in desperation, to listen for the same names repeated through centuries of torment. In confronting evil, the Church must understand it, not embrace it, but study its lies carefully. Because what is written in darkness still echoes, even if no one reads it aloud. Among the names whispered with reverence in the world of Vatican exorcism, none carries as much weight as Father Gabriele Amorth. For over 3 decades, he served as the chief exorcist of the Diocese of Rome, performing thousands of exorcisms and becoming the most visible face of a largely hidden ministry. He spoke plainly, often critically, about the dangers he believed were ignored by the modern Church. Yet even with his outspoken interviews and writings, much of Father Amorth's life remained quiet, especially the contents of his private journals. These diaries, kept in handwritten Italian and stored in a modest binding, were not published. They were entrusted to a select few within the congregation for the doctrine of the faith after his death in 2016. Sealed and reviewed under the condition that most entries remain confidential. What lies within is not a catalogue of demons or spells, but a spiritual record of weariness, persistence, and faith shaken, but never broken. In these pages, he described cases too sensitive to name in public. A woman from Spain who fell into seizures only when Gregorian chant was played. A bishop who privately confessed that he had been stalked for years by a presence he could not see, but always sensed. A young seminarian who, after a failed rite, asked to leave the priesthood out of fear he would be targeted again. Amorth wrote not with drama, but with solemnity. He emphasized the mental strain of the work, how prolonged exorcisms took a toll not only on the body but the soul of the exorcist. He admitted nights of doubt, he recorded prayers that failed, and he warned repeatedly that the greatest trick of evil was not to inspire fear, but indifference. Perhaps the most sobering entry recounts his experience with a man who had been involved in satanic rituals for decades before seeking help. Amorth describes a confrontation that lasted months, during which the man spoke languages he had never studied, recited scripture backward, and once passed out cold the moment the Eucharist entered the room. The man survived, but never fully returned to himself. Amorth wrote simply, "Some wounds the soul carries forever. We do not always win, we only resist." His journals do not glorify the right, they humble it. They remind the Church that exorcists are not warriors, but witnesses, standing at the threshold, praying that the door holds. Before an exorcist ever speaks the first prayer, before a rite is considered, before the Roman ritual is opened, the Church insists on something often overlooked: observation, not of the dramatic, but of the subtle. The Vatican teaches that true possession rarely begins with spectacle. It begins with small fractures, behavioral changes that defy explanation, shifts in voice or gaze, reactions to sacred objects, the presence of knowledge the afflicted should not possess. These details matter. The work of the exorcist begins not in the ritual, but in the investigation, and it is in the smallest things that the enemy first reveals itself. One case from 1992, kept in the diocesan archives of Milan, involved a teenager whose parents reported sudden mood swings and outbursts. At first, it resembled depression or perhaps bipolar disorder. But what caught the attention of the local priest was the way she reacted to his presence, not with fear, but with recognition, though they had never met. During a home visit, she addressed him by his baptismal name, a name known only to his parents. She refused to look at the crucifix around his neck, but laughed when it was removed. These moments are where the priest begins to listen differently. The Church has long insisted that medical and psychological evaluations come first. Possession is exceedingly rare. Most cases turn out to be mental illness, trauma, or emotional manipulation. But in those rare cases where something deeper lingers, it is not the thrashing limbs or guttural screams that convince the exorcist. It is the fine grain, the spontaneous knowledge of Latin phrases, the recoiling at sacred images without prompt, the inability to enter a church despite previous devotion. These signs are documented carefully. Patterns are compared with previous cases. Only when the consistency becomes undeniable does the exorcist begin to prepare. The possessed often remember little afterward. They describe it as a dream, a shadow moving through them, but the exorcist remembers everything. He must. His task is not to be impressed by chaos, but to recognize the counterfeit hidden beneath the ordinary. Because evil, when it seeks to enter, does not knock. It lingers at the edges, quiet, familiar, waiting for someone to miss the detail. Behind every authorized exorcism is a long chain of discernment. And at the heart of that chain are the Church's most discreet consultants, the demonology experts. These men, rarely known by name, are theologians and spiritual advisors appointed by bishops or directly connected to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Their role is not to perform the rite, but to verify whether the rite should be performed at all. Their lives are not shaped by spectacle, but by study. Years spent poring over scripture, patristic writings, exorcism records, and the coded language of possession. They are the ones the Vatican turns to when a case resists easy categorization, when symptoms are ambiguous, or when a diocese hesitates to act. Their task is not to confirm the supernatural, it is to eliminate every other possibility. Most of these experts work in silence, attached to seminaries or teaching posts, blending academic rigor with pastoral sensitivity. One such man, a Jesuit based in Spain, was known within his circle for his methodical approach. He kept a dossier of case studies from across Europe, noting the language patterns of the afflicted, the timing of episodes, and the environmental triggers that surrounded each event. He was fluent in 6 languages and deeply trained in classical philosophy, but what made him invaluable was his detachment. He did not fear what he studied, he respected it. He understood that evil rarely shouted, it whispered, and recognizing that whisper required a disciplined mind. When consulted, These experts often spend weeks examining reports. They interview the afflicted, the family, the clergy involved. They cross-reference symptoms with known medical conditions. They consult psychologists. If, after all this, they find the case consistent with historical signs of possession, they make a single recommendation to the bishop to authorize the rite. But even then, they remain involved, watching, recording, and advising. Their presence is never meant to validate fear. It is to ensure that faith is not misused. The Vatican holds these men in quiet regard. They are the bridge between belief and responsibility. In a world that increasingly demands proof, they are tasked with discerning what lies just outside the reach of reason, not to chase shadows, but to name them carefully, clearly, and only when there is no doubt left to hide behind. Not all demonic disturbances come from unknown causes. Some are invited, deliberately, ritualistically, and with chilling precision. In the outer quarters of Rome, far from the Vatican's walls, but never quite beyond its reach, there have been quiet reports across the centuries of clandestine gatherings dedicated not to worship but to inversion. The Black Mass, a ritual designed to mock the Catholic liturgy and draw the attention of infernal powers, is not folklore to the Church. It is a reality that Vatican exorcists have confronted, rarely but gravely. Though popular culture exaggerates its symbols and actions, the essence of the Black Mass lies in desecration, a deliberate reversal of sacred order meant to glorify rebellion, degradation, and despair. Some of the earliest documented cases date back to the 17th century, when the Roman Inquisition investigated a series of ritualistic crimes involving noble families and hired clergy. One such case, buried within the congregation's sealed volumes, involved a defrocked priest found in possession of an inverted crucifix, chalices stained with animal blood, and fragments of what appeared to be consecrated hosts. The man claimed he had been paid to perform these rites for a private audience of skeptics and occultists, curious to taste blasphemy without believing in it. But the Vatican took the matter seriously, not because of theatrical fear, but because desecration in its rawest form invites something deeper. Modern cases are more discreet. In 1999, a suburban Roman parish reported a break-in in which the tabernacle had been forced open and the consecrated hosts stolen. No money was taken, no damage done to the rest of the church. Days later, nearby farmers found remnants of a burned altar in the woods, along with scorched pages from the Gospel of John. The police investigated but found no leads. The diocese quietly contacted an exorcist not to confront a person but to cleanse a place. The Church does not treat black masses as rumors. When evidence arises, repeated desecration, inexplicable activity near the site, or spiritual disturbances in those involved, exorcists are sent not only to pray, but to reclaim. The rite is performed over the ground itself. Salt is poured. Psalms are spoken aloud, because in these cases it is not a soul that must be freed. It is the land itself that must be returned to silence. One of the most disquieting patterns in documented cases of possession is the sudden fluency of the afflicted in languages they have never studied. Among these, Latin appears with unsettling frequency. Not the church Latin taught in seminaries or recited in hymns, but the ancient classical form, spoken with a fluency and pronunciation that even trained scholars find difficult to replicate. In Vatican records, there are multiple instances of individuals, often young, often from unremarkable backgrounds, who, during possession, begin speaking in Latin with such precision that exorcists pause mid-prayer. It is not a theatrical flourish. It is an unmistakable intellectual intrusion, and the Church takes it very seriously. One such case occurred in Naples in 1965. A 12-year-old boy from a modest household began experiencing violent outbursts and trance-like states. He had never attended Latin Mass and came from a family with no higher education. But during one episode, witnessed by 2 priests and a visiting bishop, he began quoting lengthy passages from Livy's Ab Urbe Condita, a classical Roman history text unlikely to be known even by most Latin teachers. The boy's voice deepened unnaturally, and his syntax was flawless. When later questioned by his parish priest, he could not recall anything and showed no understanding of Latin at all. Another case, preserved in a sealed folder at the Vatican, involved a woman in northern France in 1981. During the rite, she interrupted the priest's prayer by quoting a line from St. Jerome's Vulgate, but corrected his pronunciation, then launched into a critique of a theological error the priest had made. The exorcist later wrote that he felt less opposed and more unmasked, as if my own weakness was being used as a mirror. That case took months to resolve. The Church teaches that demons, as fallen intelligences, are not bound by language the way we are. They do not learn. They remember. Latin is not holy in itself, but it carries centuries of sacred weight, and that weight, when twisted, becomes a weapon. When a possessed person speaks Latin fluently, it is not proof of evil, but a signal. Something ancient has entered the room, and it has been waiting to be understood. There are cases that end quickly, where the afflicted weep, convulse, and then calm as if a cloud has passed. But those are not the ones that haunt exorcists. The ones that linger in memory are the slow battles, the ones that unfold over weeks, then months, and sometimes over a year or more. These are the rituals that test not only the strength of the afflicted, but the stamina and faith of the priest. Among the most harrowing on record is a case documented by the Diocese of Palermo in the early 1990s, involving a woman in her mid-30s, whose exorcism stretched across 13 months. It was not a failure, it was a siege. The woman, whom church records refer to only by an initial, had no criminal history and no psychiatric diagnosis that could fully explain her condition. She began experiencing what her parish priest first believed were night terrors, violent dreams, sleep paralysis, whispers in languages no one in her household spoke. Over time, these episodes began to affect her waking hours. She grew erratic, developed an aversion to religious symbols, and would enter dissociative states during Mass, often collapsing or speaking in tongues when the consecration occurred. After a thorough psychological evaluation and multiple failed attempts at counseling, the case was referred to the local bishop. An experienced exorcist was assigned. The rite began quietly in a chapel near the sea, far from her home. The first few sessions produced no dramatic effect, but by the sixth, she began to respond violently, not physically, but vocally. She uttered names the priest had not spoken aloud. She mocked his private sins. She refused to say the name of Christ. Each session would end with exhaustion, both hers and his. Sometimes there would be weeks between sessions to allow recovery. Over 13 months, she began to change. Her voice softened. Her resistance weakened. The turning point came not during a dramatic moment, but during a silent prayer of deliverance. Her tears returned, not of pain, but relief. The final session lasted under an hour. She left under her own strength and never returned. The records remain sealed and her identity protected. But among those who served in that diocese, the case is remembered not as a miracle, but as a reminder. Exorcism is not an instant victory. It is endurance. It is prayer repeated until something finally lets go. One of the most pressing dilemmas facing the modern exorcist is not demonic resistance, but diagnostic uncertainty. In a time when neuroscience and psychiatry have transformed our understanding of the human mind, the line between possession and mental illness has never been more fraught. The Church is acutely aware of this tension. Before any exorcism can be authorized, a thorough psychological and medical evaluation is required, not out of skepticism, but out of respect for the complexity of human suffering. The Vatican knows that it is dangerously easy to mistake one affliction for another, and no exorcist wants to do harm under the guise of help. The case of Father Jacques Morel, a French priest active in the 1970s, highlights this ambiguity. He was called to investigate a young man who exhibited violent outbursts, heard voices, and reacted to religious images with hostility. But the symptoms did not escalate according to known possession patterns. The man could enter a church without resistance. He showed no knowledge of foreign languages or hidden information. Still, he claimed to be tormented by a presence that lived inside his spine. Morel, uncertain, consulted a psychiatrist, an atheist by conviction, who diagnosed the man with schizoaffective disorder. Treatment was begun, and within months, the violent episodes ceased. Medication, not prayer, brought peace, and Morel never forgot it. Yet not every case conforms so cleanly. In the late 2000s, a woman in Argentina underwent extensive psychiatric care for what was believed to be a personality disorder. She responded well to therapy until she was handed a rosary during a group session and immediately entered a screaming fit, biting through the beads and collapsing. Her therapists, shaken, referred her to a local bishop who assigned an exorcist. Over the next 5 sessions, she exhibited behavior that defied their previous diagnosis: levitation, xenoglossia, and near superhuman strength. The therapists were invited to observe. One of them converted shortly after. These blurred boundaries are where the Church works most carefully. Exorcists are not taught to assume. They are taught to wait, to discern, to partner with science where it offers truth. Possession is rare, but it is not extinct, and when it hides within the mind, it must be approached with fear, not of the demon, but of the risk of not recognizing one. Beneath the ancient city of Rome lies a vast and silent world, a labyrinth of catacombs carved into soft volcanic stone, where generations of early Christians buried their dead and carved prayers into walls by candlelight. These tunnels are sacred, but not untouched by darkness. Over the centuries, stories have emerged from guides, clergy, and visitors alike describing strange sounds, sudden chills, and an unshakable sense of being watched in certain corridors. Most of these are dismissed as imagination, the product of damp air and shadowed stone. But one story, recorded quietly in the archives of a Roman seminary in 1954, tells of an exorcism performed in the catacombs, not on a person, but on a place. The case began when several seminarians assigned to historical cataloging reported the same experience: intense nausea and dizziness when entering a specific burial chamber. They each described an oppressive presence, not malicious, but suffocating, as if the space itself had forgotten how to breathe. Their supervisor, a soft-spoken priest known for his skepticism, dismissed the reports at first. But when a visiting lecturer fell unconscious in the same chamber with no medical cause found, the seminary rector took notice. The church dispatched a priest trained in blessings and minor exorcisms, believing it to be a spiritual residue, perhaps unrested souls or centuries of unconfessed pain embedded in the stone. He brought no assistance, only the rite of blessing and a crucifix. For several hours he prayed aloud in Latin, walking the length of the corridor and reading psalms. At the site of the reported incidents, he placed a relic of Saint Agnes and recited a prayer of deliverance not against possession, but against what he called oppressive memory. He later wrote that the chamber felt heavy with history, but lighter when I left. After the rite, no further incidents were reported. The chamber was opened for study, and the seminarians resumed their work. But the priest who performed the blessing never returned. In a private note, he wrote that the catacombs held more than just bones. They held centuries of sorrow, sealed into the earth. And sometimes what lingers beneath Rome is not evil in form, but grief in silence. Not every story in the Church's long struggle against darkness ends with triumph. Some vanish into silence, leaving behind only fragments, testimonies, letters, and unanswered questions. One such case is that of Father Tommaso Benedetti, a Vatican-trained exorcist assigned to a rural parish near Perugia in the late 1930s. He was known for his devotion, his quiet demeanor, and his meticulous approach to every case. For nearly a decade, he worked uneventfully, performing minor rites, offering spiritual counsel, and avoiding attention. But in 1948, something changed. He was called to investigate a reclusive widow whose erratic behavior had unsettled her entire village. What followed was a series of private exorcism sessions that consumed the final year of his life. And then, without warning, he disappeared. The diocesan records note the early stages of the case. The woman, whose name was withheld even in internal memos, had reportedly begun speaking in voices not her own, attacking sacred images, and describing dreams in which a man in black visited her and instructed her to unmake the word. Father Benedetti took the case with caution. He did not begin with a rite, but instead spent weeks praying with her, attempting to determine whether the affliction was spiritual or psychological. But as the months passed, his letters grew increasingly strange. In one, he wrote to a colleague in Rome, "She knows my thoughts before I speak them. The psalms echo in her mouth before I open the book. I fear I have drawn too close." By late summer, his reports ceased altogether. Parishioners said he stopped celebrating Mass. His home was found in disarray, books open, candles burned down to wax, the crucifix in his chapel floor down. The woman he had been treating had returned to silence, neither violent nor healed. She was later placed in the care of a distant convent, where she lived out the rest of her life in total silence. Father Benedetti's body was never found. The Church did not issue a public statement. Within Vatican circles, his name is occasionally mentioned among the lost clergy, those who disappeared under unclear circumstances during rites. Some believe he succumbed to madness, others that he broke a rule unknown to others, but the records remain locked. Only his crucifix, recovered from the site, was sent back to Rome. It now rests in a sealed reliquary in the Lateran Basilica. Some cases never involve a ritual. Some never even involve the possessed. But they still find their way into the Vatican's files. Stories too consistent, too unsettling, and too persistent to be ignored. One such account comes from 1922 from a convent on the outskirts of Krakow, Poland. It centers around a cloistered nun named Sister Rosalia, known by her fellow sisters as a gentle, reclusive soul who spent most of her time in prayer or tending the sick. She had no history of illness, no history of visions. But over the course of 8 nights, she began dreaming the same thing. A single corridor filled with locked doors, and behind each door, a voice screaming to be let out. She told no one at first, but by the 3rd night, the dreams changed. She began to hear names, dozens of them. Not names from her life, but ancient names, foreign names, names she could not pronounce. She began writing them down in the dark before morning prayers. When she finally confessed to the Mother Superior, she brought a stack of papers, each page covered in unfamiliar characters and names. Some were gibberish. but several matched known demonic entities recorded in church grimoires, including some never spoken of outside of restricted libraries. The Vatican was alerted. 2 priests were dispatched to the convent, not to perform an exorcism, but to investigate. Sister Rosalia was interviewed extensively. She claimed no visions, no voices during the day, only in dreams. She had no idea what the names meant. She had never studied Latin or demonology. When presented with the Ars Goetia, a book she had never seen, she recognized several sigils without hesitation. One priest reportedly asked her how she knew them. Her only reply, "They were carved into the walls." No possession was declared. No rite was performed. But the Vatican quietly removed the papers and instructed the convent to assign Sister Rosalia to silence and perpetual adoration. She lived out the rest of her days quietly and without further disturbance. But the dream journals, preserved now in the Vatican archives, remain a curiosity and a warning. Sometimes the voices do not possess, sometimes they only whisper, and sometimes they choose listeners no one expects. There are rooms within the Vatican that have fallen into disuse, not because they are structurally unsound, but because something lingers there that no one wants to disturb. One such room exists deep within the Apostolic Palace, down a hallway that once led to the private quarters of a long-deceased cardinal. Officially, it is listed as a storage space, but the few who know of its history speak of it in hushed tones. The Vatican has never issued a public statement. It doesn't need to. Everyone who has spent time inside that room agrees something stayed behind. Its story begins in 1903 with Cardinal Sebastiani, a brilliant but difficult man known for his obsession with the writings of early mystics. He believed holiness was forged through suffering, and he often imposed intense fasts and mortifications upon himself. But toward the end of his life, something changed. He began to speak of shadows that followed him, of voices that echoed in his private prayers. His confessor grew concerned and contacted the Holy Office, which at the time managed inquiries into spiritual disturbances. When officials entered the room, they found its walls covered with notes, scripture passages, and symbols scrawled in charcoal. Candles were burned down in clusters on the floor. A single crucifix had been nailed upside down above the bed. The cardinal was found curled in a chair, alive but unresponsive, clutching a piece of paper that simply read, "Non dormit qui custodit malum." He who keeps evil does not sleep. He died days later. The room was sealed, cleaned, and reconsecrated. But over the following years, odd reports continued. Priests assigned to nearby quarters complained of sleeplessness and disorientation. One Swiss guard reported hearing murmured prayers behind the door when no one was inside. A visiting scholar claimed he heard his name whispered while walking past. Eventually, the room was locked and left alone. Today, it remains inaccessible. The key is kept in a separate archive, labeled only with a numeral, No official rite of exorcism was ever performed, perhaps because no one was ever fully possessed, but those who walk past it lower their voices and cross themselves, as if instinctively sensing that not all hauntings are visible. Some are quiet, some sit in stillness, waiting for recognition. Tucked away in a lesser-known wing of Vatican City lies a chamber known only by those who need it, the Silent Room. It appears on no tour map and carries no plaque. There are no relics, no frescoes, no chairs, just a single wooden kneeler in the center of a soundproofed stone chamber bathed in perpetual shadow. It is not a confessional. It is not a chapel. It is a space designed for one purpose: to contain spiritual phenomena that cannot yet be named. It is a waiting room for the inexplicable. The Silent Room was established in the 1960s under the guidance of Monsignor Pietro Corsi, a theologian who had spent decades studying possession cases across Europe. He proposed that certain individuals under spiritual duress did not require immediate exorcism, but silence, a total removal from stimulus, voice, and observation. He had found that in cases where the afflicted were overwhelmed by conflicting diagnoses, mental illness, trauma, obsession, the absence of attention sometimes led to clarity or to escalation. Either way, the room provided an answer. The church built the space beneath a lesser-used archive, lining the walls with sound-dampening stone and sealing it with a single reinforced door. No electronics are allowed inside, no windows. Light is controlled manually, and only one person is permitted in the room at a time. Before anyone enters, they are instructed to pray silently, write nothing, and speak no words, regardless of what they see or feel. Over the decades, the room has hosted dozens of visitors. Some were suspected of possession. Others were theologians or psychologists asked to sit inside and reflect. One cardinal, now deceased, entered for just 15 minutes and emerged with tears streaming down his face, refusing to explain what had happened. Another man, a lay researcher, entered and began sobbing uncontrollably, though he could not articulate why. The church does not advertise the room. It does not claim miracles nor threats. It merely maintains the space, because sometimes the absence of sound reveals what noise conceals. Sometimes it is in the utter stillness that the soul makes itself known or is forced to face what resides within. In 1974, a case reached the attention of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that began, strangely, with something mundane: mirrors. A young girl in Palermo, just 13, had begun refusing to enter any room where she might see her reflection. At first, her family believed it to be a simple childhood fear or an onset of anxiety. But as weeks passed, her behavior grew erratic. She began covering mirrors with cloth, avoiding spoons and water, anything that gave a glimpse of her own face. When forced to look, she would scream uncontrollably, insisting it wasn't her she saw, but something behind her eyes. The family sought medical advice. A psychiatrist diagnosed her with dissociative symptoms brought on by trauma, though no incident could be found. She was given medication, therapy sessions, and temporarily removed from school. Nothing helped. Her behavior worsened. She spoke to herself in the mirror, whispering names her parents couldn't recognize. One night, her younger brother reported hearing a second voice answer her back, one that mimicked her tone but not her words. The local priest, Father Lucenti, was skeptical when called. He had dealt with enough anxious parents and overactive children to know how stories can grow in the retelling. But during his visit, he watched her from the hallway as she walked past a mirror and froze. Her reflection did not. He later described it as a moment of breathlessness, as if the world forgot its rules for just 1 second. He did not report it officially, but he returned every week after that, praying silently in the home. Months later, the girl collapsed during Mass. When revived, she claimed she had seen her own face laughing at her from the baptismal font. The bishop, now aware of the case, ordered a formal evaluation. No full possession was declared, but a minor rite of exorcism was approved, not to expel, but to protect. The priest performed the prayer not in her home, but in front of a mirror wrapped in white cloth. She recovered slowly. The mirror was never uncovered. To this day, her case remains listed among spiritual intrusions, a Vatican category used for those who are not possessed, but shadowed. Not every haunting takes hold of the body. Some wait in the glass, reflected but never spoken. There is a quiet truth known to every exorcist. The rite does not leave you untouched. Even when successful, even when the afflicted is freed and peace returns, something lingers. A residue, a weariness, a memory that replays at the edge of prayer. For this reason, the Church requires that every appointed exorcist have not only a superior, but a confessor, someone who listens not just to sin, but to strain. It is a tradition nearly as old as the rite itself, and behind the scenes of every dramatic account lies the story of a priest silently absorbing another's burden. Father Enzo Valieri was one such confessor. He never performed a single exorcism himself. He had no appetite for confrontation and little interest in spiritual warfare. But for over 25 years, he heard the confessions of exorcists across the Italian dioceses, men who came to him not with tales of pride or lust, but with the weight of what they had seen. He never recorded their names. He never wrote a single word down. But in his final years, he spoke briefly, anonymously, to a Vatican archivist. What he described was not the drama of demons, but the slow unraveling of men. One priest confessed that after a particularly violent rite, he could no longer sleep near mirrors. Another admitted that every time he prayed alone, he heard laughter. A third described feeling spiritually empty after a long case, as if something had left with the demon. Valieri would listen, never offering judgment. He prescribed not penance, but rest, retreat. He would recommend days in silence, confession for the confessor, and always, always prayer with others. Isolation, he said, was where the darkness circled back. The Church understands that the exorcist's danger is not always external. Pride can take root, despair can fester, doubt can grow in the soil left behind by evil. That is why the confessor exists, to remind the exorcist that he, too, is human, that he, too, can be wounded, and that even in the fight against shadows, the soul must be tended as carefully as the body of the possessed. There are some names that reappear in the archives, not often, and never without caution, but enough to raise the hairs on the necks of those who study the old files. The Church, for all its discretion, has noted the recurrence of certain patterns, specific traits, phrases, even voices, across cases separated by geography and decades. Among these, one stands out, a presence known not by any official name, but by the phrase it speaks when first confronted: "I never left." The first recorded case using those words comes from Vienna, 1912. A young woman undergoing the rite suddenly stopped convulsing, turned to the priest and whispered in Latin, "Num quam discessi." The room reportedly chilled. The exorcist wrote that it felt as though someone familiar had stepped back into the room. She recovered, but 15 years later, in a remote village outside Warsaw, a boy under very different circumstances spoke the same phrase. He had never learned Latin. The pattern continued. A man in Brazil in the 1950s, a nun in the Philippines in the 1970s, a teenager in rural Spain in 2003. None knew each other, none had overlapping lives, but when confronted with the crucifix, each one uttered that same line, in the same tongue. The Vatican does not name demons lightly, and when one seems to cross oceans, languages, and generations, it is not named at all, it is watched. Father Matteo Renzi, a scholar of demonology, believed this entity, or whatever it was, operated not by possession alone, but by mimicry. It studied its victims. It learned from failed rites. In one case, it pretended to be a child's imaginary friend for over 2 years before revealing itself. In another, it imitated the voice of a dead parent. The goal, Renzi believed, was not control, it was infiltration, slow, patient, and unrelenting. There is no formal doctrine on repeat demonic identities. The Church moves carefully, unwilling to fuel superstition. But those who've heard the phrase never forget it, because "I never left" isn't just a warning, it's a reminder. Some forces do not need to arrive, they only need to be noticed. Perched above the glistening waters of Lake Albano, the papal summer residence of Castel Gandolfo has long been a place of retreat for the Roman pontiff. Within its peaceful gardens and Renaissance halls, many popes have taken refuge from the demands of Rome. But during one summer in the 1950s, the residence hosted not tranquility, but torment. The incident, buried in obscure diocesan records and never publicly acknowledged by the Vatican, centered on a guest of a guest. a teenage girl whose arrival coincided with a series of inexplicable events that would rattle even seasoned clergy. The girl, a distant relative of a Vatican administrator, had been brought to the residence as a courtesy, a quiet stay in the countryside after the sudden loss of her parents. For the first few days, nothing seemed unusual, but on the fourth night the household staff began reporting screams from her chamber, piercing, guttural cries unlike anything they had heard before. When they entered her room, she was awake, sitting upright, staring blankly at the wall. She claimed not to remember anything. These episodes continued, always at night, always at the same hour. Bibles left on her bedside table were found torn. Religious paintings were pulled from the wall. On one occasion, the girl reportedly spoke in a harsh dialect of Aramaic, a language no one in the house could identify at the time. When Vatican security contacted a linguist to transcribe her speech, he confirmed the language, an archaic prayer, inverted in meaning, used to profane rather than praise. A decision was made. The girl was moved to a nearby Benedictine monastery under the care of a discreet group of clergy. A private rite was performed over the course of 5 sessions. No possession was ever officially declared, but the girl improved. The screaming stopped. She returned to school under a different name. To this day, a guest room in Castel Gandolfo remains unused, its doors locked, its furniture covered. Officially, it is under renovation, but those who serve the papal residence know otherwise. They still speak of the summer when the lake reflected more than sunlight. It echoed the cries of something that did not belong, and something the walls still remember. Within the rituals of the Church, fire holds a sacred place. It symbolizes divine presence, illumination, and purification. But there are moments when fire behaves in ways that challenge both physics and faith. One such incident, documented in a quietly shelved file from a Roman parish in 1986, involved a single votive candle that refused to extinguish, despite every attempt and in defiance of logic. It was not a miracle. It was a warning. The incident occurred during preparations for an evening mass. The sacristan, an elderly man named Gianni, lit the candles on the small altar in the side chapel of St. Cecilia. One flame, nestled in a tall glass holder, flared higher than the others. He thought nothing of it. But when Mass ended and the others flickered out naturally, this candle burned brighter, unwavering, untouched by drafts or time. Gianni tried to blow it out. Nothing. He tried smothering it with the brass snuffer. The flame danced, resisted, then reappeared seconds later without spark or sound. The parish priest was summoned. He too attempted to extinguish it, first with holy water, then with a damp cloth. Still the flame endured, and then something stranger happened. Over the next hour, the chapel temperature dropped sharply. Parishioners who entered complained of sudden headaches. A child collapsed in the back pew. The priest, alarmed, began reciting prayers of protection aloud, and only then, during the invocation of Saint Michael, did the flame dim, sputter, and finally vanish in a hiss. Later examination revealed nothing remarkable about the candle. It was made from standard beeswax, purchased in bulk. The glass was ordinary. There was no hidden mechanism, but the church took notice. A minor rite was performed over the altar. The candle holder was quietly removed and sent to the Vatican for analysis. It never returned. In theological terms, no doctrine defines such phenomena. The flame was not deemed miraculous nor demonic, but among those who understand signs, the kind that linger on the edge of explanation, it served as a message. Sometimes the things that resist being extinguished are not symbols of light. Sometimes they are the last flickers of something that refuses to leave. Deep in the Vatican's archival wing lies a small collection marked non catalogato, not catalogued. These are items that have no clear place in theological libraries or historical indexes. Among them, in a drawer with no label and no cross-reference, sits a reel-to-reel audio tape dated March 1977. The label reads simply, Roma, caso number 217, non riprodurre. It was never transcribed. Few even know of its existence. But those who have heard it remember the sound, not the words, but the way they made the air feel thinner. The tape was recorded during an exorcism in a private residence on the outskirts of Rome. A young seminarian had been invited to observe the ritual and, without permission, brought a portable recorder. He believed it would help him later analyze the structure of the prayers, to understand the rhythm of the rite. What he captured instead was 22 minutes of fragmented voices, cries, and a final sound that has never been explained. The seminarian, shaken by what he heard on playback, turned the tape over to his superior the following morning and never returned to the seminary. The Vatican took possession of the tape immediately. It was played only twice more, once by a linguist, once by a theologian specializing in angelology. Both men refused to comment publicly afterward. In a private memo, the linguist reported hearing phrases in Babylonian Akkadian, a dead language he had studied but never expected to encounter in any real-world context. The theologian, when pressed by a colleague, is rumored to have said, "It wasn't the language that frightened me, it was the tone. Something was laughing." Since then, the reel has remained in silence. No copies were made. No digital backups exist. It is stored in a cold, fireproof case beneath a layer of paperwork so thick it might as well be forgotten. But among a small circle of Vatican scholars, it is occasionally spoken of, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a boundary not to be crossed. Some things are recorded not for clarity, but for containment. And in the Vatican's depths, silence is sometimes the only safeguard left. Possession is often imagined in stillness, in dimly lit rooms, isolated abbeys, or stone chapels far from public view. But evil is not bound by location. It does not wait for ceremony or invitation. One of the most perplexing cases recorded by Vatican observers took place not in a church or home, but on a moving train between Milan and Bologna in 1991. It involved no clergy, no preparation, and no warning. And yet, by the end of the journey, a priest would be summoned, a compartment sealed, and one life forever changed. The incident began on the 9:20 evening express. A young woman, traveling alone, was seated in a near-empty car. Midway through the journey, other passengers reported hearing a rhythmic knocking from her compartment, followed by muffled speech in what sounded like an Eastern European tongue. The conductor, thinking she was ill or in distress, opened the door and immediately backed out. According to the official railway report, the woman was crouched on the floor, her eyes rolled back, hands twisted at unnatural angles, chanting in a guttural voice. Attempts to restrain her failed. She lashed out with sudden strength, biting one of the attendants and tearing a rosary from another passenger's neck. A doctor on board attempted sedation, but the woman knocked the vial from his hand, speaking now in perfect, unaccented Latin. A retired priest traveling in another car was alerted. When he entered, he reportedly gasped and began reciting the Pater Noster aloud. The woman responded with violent screams, clawing at her own face. At the next station, the train was quietly halted. Police secured the area, but the priest requested privacy. He remained with her for over an hour, performing a protective rite with only a pocket crucifix and whispered prayer. When she was removed from the train, she was unconscious, but breathing steadily. She later claimed no memory of the event, no history of illness, no religious background at all. The priest filed a brief report with his diocese. The woman's identity remains protected and no further manifestations were recorded. But for the Vatican, the event was added to a growing list of incidents that defy the predictable, because darkness moves with us. Not just in sacred places, not just in shadows. Sometimes it finds you on a journey you thought was ordinary. In the spring of 1933, a young Italian priest named Father Luca Bellardi began experiencing what he described in letters as heat without flame. He had recently been assigned to a small mountain parish near Trento, far from the bustle of Rome, where he served quietly and without distinction. But during his evening prayers, he began to feel sudden waves of heat, first on his hands, then on his chest, as if he were standing near an unseen fire. There was no fever, no physical explanation. But the sensation intensified. It did not hurt at first. It frightened. Soon the phenomena expanded. Wooden crucifixes in his chapel began to char at the edges without flame. Pages in his Bible darkened along the margins as though scorched by invisible coals. One night, as he prepared for bed, he removed his cassock and found blister-like marks on his shoulders, perfectly circular and cold to the touch. When he reported these incidents to his bishop, the reply was swift: withdraw from public ministry and submit to observation. The Vatican was notified. 2 investigators, both Jesuits, arrived quietly in June. They examined Father Bellardi, his chapel, and his writings. They found no flammable materials, no evidence of self-harm, no trace of chemical tampering. What they did find disturbed them more. A diary entry in which the priest had written, "The heat is not pain. It is invitation. It wants me to speak." The investigators questioned him, but he had no memory of writing those words. His mental state seemed stable, but his body bore the marks of burns that had no source. He was relocated to a monastery in Lombardy, placed under watch. During his stay, the strange burns stopped, but at night other monks reported hearing whispers from his cell, as if he were conversing with someone just beyond the wall. A minor rite of deliverance was performed, not to exorcise, but to protect. Afterward, the heat never returned. Father Bellardi resumed a quiet life, eventually retiring in obscurity. The Vatican never declared it possession. They never named what happened, but his file remains open. Because there are afflictions that do not scream or twist or speak in ancient tongues. Some simply burn without fire until someone listens. In the late winter of 1968, an envelope arrived at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, bearing no return address, only the seal of a rural French diocese. Inside was a handwritten letter from a priest named Father Claude Reynaud, pleading for guidance on a case involving a parishioner plagued by violent outbursts, nightmares, and blasphemous speech. The letter described symptoms familiar to exorcists: levitation, knowledge of hidden things, and an aversion to consecrated objects. The letter was dated March the 3rd. It was received by Vatican couriers on February 27th. The archivist who opened it assumed the date was an error. Letters sometimes took days to cross borders. He filed the report, marked it for internal review, and moved on. But 6 days later, another letter arrived, this time officially postmarked and sealed by the same French parish, dated March 3rd, identical in content to the one already in Vatican hands, word for word, paragraph for paragraph. The only difference was a short postscript in the second letter. "I fear it knows I've written." Perplexed, the Vatican reached out to Father Reynaud. He confirmed he had sent only one letter on March 3rd. He had no knowledge of the earlier arrival. When informed that the first letter had come nearly a week prior to being written, he reportedly went silent, then asked if anyone else had touched it. The church dispatched 2 priests to the parish to investigate. They found a woman, mid-40s, withdrawn and emotionally fragile. She would not speak during interviews, but when shown a photograph of Father Reynaud, she began to weep and whisper, "He told me they would come." According to the priests, the case did not escalate. There was no formal exorcism, but the psychological and spiritual tension in the village was palpable. Mass attendance had dropped. Parishioners avoided the rectory. The original letter, the one that arrived before it was written, is still kept in the archive, now encased in a climate-controlled drawer. No explanation has been given. Time, the Church has always believed, is a creation of God. But evil does not always obey it. Sometimes it moves ahead of us, whispering what we've not yet said, already waiting for what we thought we chose. In the Orthodox tradition, icons are not merely paintings. They are considered windows, portals through which the faithful can contemplate the divine. In 1951, a Byzantine-style icon of Christ Pantocrator was gifted to a small Catholic parish in Bari by an Eastern bishop visiting Rome. The icon was old, painted on oak with gold leaf and natural pigments, its expression serene, its gaze calm. It was placed in a side chapel where it became a quiet presence during daily mass. For months, nothing seemed unusual, until parishioners began to comment that the icon's eyes were difficult to meet, not because they were frightening, but because they moved. At first, it was dismissed as pious imagination. Light can play tricks on painted surfaces. But the reports grew more specific. A deacon swore the eyes followed him as he moved past the altar. A child claimed Christ blinked. A nun reported hearing a low hum when kneeling before it in silent prayer. The priest in charge, Father Sebastiano, was skeptical but agreed to observe. One morning, alone in the chapel, he stared into the icon's gaze for over 10 minutes. When he emerged, he was visibly shaken and refused to speak of what he had seen. He ordered the chapel closed. The diocese was notified. 2 theologians were dispatched to inspect the icon, along with an art restorer. The restorer found no hidden mechanisms. The paint was traditional, the wood unaltered, but the theologians were less certain. During prayer, one claimed to hear words forming not in his ears but in his chest. The message was simple: do not ask, do not touch. Despite the lack of supernatural confirmation, the icon was quietly removed and stored in a secured Vatican repository. To this day, the icon has not been displayed again. Officially, it is undergoing restoration, but within certain clerical circles, it is referred to as speculum inversum, the inverted mirror. Because whatever looked through those eyes may not have reflected divine mercy. It may have been looking back, waiting, measuring who was watching and who was willing to stare too long. At a Benedictine monastery in southern Germany in 1949, a quiet monk named Brother Anselm began his morning like every other. Early prayers before sunrise, followed by silent meditation in the chapel. He had lived there since he was 16, never traveled beyond the region, and spoke only German and Latin, the languages of prayer and order. But on this particular morning, when the abbot greeted him in the cloister with a gentle Pax Tecum, Anselm responded in fluent Koine Greek, a language he had never studied. At first they thought he was joking or perhaps had suffered a stroke. But his body was healthy, his demeanor calm. When they questioned him, he spoke only in Greek, refusing or unable to return to German. He answered theological questions with precision, quoting obscure passages from early church fathers. He corrected the pronunciation of others who tried to speak with him. The abbot, troubled, wrote to the Vatican describing the incident not as madness, but as an invasion of speech without invitation. 3 scholars from the Pontifical Biblical Institute were sent to examine Brother Anselm. They tested him with rare dialects, early scriptural forms, even regional variants from ancient Asia Minor. He responded with fluent comprehension. Yet when asked who had taught him, his answer remained the same. I heard it in my dreams. More disturbing was his insistence that the words were not his own. They come through me, he said. They are not meant for me. The Vatican did not declare it demonic, nor did they rule out mystical inspiration. but one detail caused them concern. During an early interview, Anselm wrote a phrase in charcoal on the monastery wall. When translated, it read, "The voice that speaks was once silent. Now it remembers." The phrase did not match any known liturgy or scripture. After weeks of observation, the phenomenon faded. Slowly, Anselm returned to his native tongue, unable to recall what he had said or written in Greek. He lived out the rest of his life peacefully, never speaking of the incident again. But the walls of his cell were preserved, and the Vatican archived his writings under restricted classification, because language, like spirit, can be borrowed, and when something ancient begins to speak through someone who has never heard it, the Church listens, quietly, carefully, and with deep unease. In 2008, a series of anonymous letters began arriving at parishes across Europe. Each was written in a different hand but carried the same message, a description of a vivid dream in which the writer found themselves standing in the nave of a dark, crumbling cathedral. There were no pews, only shadows. A single figure knelt at the altar, whispering prayers backward. When approached, the figure turned, but had no face. The letter always ended the same way. "When I woke up, I was crying, but I don't know why." The oddity might have gone unnoticed had it not been for one fact. Dozens of people in different countries were reporting the same dream, down to the smallest detail. At first, the Vatican considered it a psychological phenomenon. Dreams, after all, can be contagious, especially when circulated online. But not all the letters were digital. Many were handwritten, mailed from rural parishes with no knowledge of the others. A few were even brought in person by frightened parishioners. Some priests reported having the dream themselves after reading the letters. In one case, a seminary in Ireland suspended classes after 6 students claimed to see the faceless figure outside their dormitory windows. The Congregation for Divine Worship assigned a small team to quietly track the phenomenon. They plotted the reports on a map. There was no clear pattern. Urban and rural, north and south. The only consistent element was the dream's emotional residue. Those who experienced it felt a lingering sorrow, as if they had touched something holy and broken. One bishop remarked in his notes, "This is not hysteria. This is grief without a name." One letter, however, stood out. It included a sketch of the cathedral interior. When compared with architectural records, it matched the layout of a church destroyed in the 30 Years' War, one that had never been rebuilt and was forgotten by most. The altar depicted matched contemporary engravings of that lost structure. The writer claimed to have never studied history. The church never issued a statement. The dreams eventually stopped. But in the Vatican's private files, the event is now categorized not under visions or apparitions, but under a newer term, shared spiritual displacement. Because sometimes what haunts is not a spirit, but a memory too powerful for one soul to carry alone. In the autumn of 1972, A Jesuit scholar named Father Andrés del Toro was conducting research in a remote Spanish monastery known for its vast collection of pre-Inquisition manuscripts. The monastery, San Millán de la Cogolla, housed thousands of texts written in Latin, Old Spanish, and early ecclesiastical dialects, many untouched for centuries. Del Toro, a seasoned paleographer, was particularly interested in a fragmented codex labeled Liber Maledictus, long rumored to contain heretical commentary on the Gospel of Mark. What he found inside, however, was something even older and much stranger. The codex's ink was darker than typical medieval iron gall, almost reddish-brown, though this wasn't unusual for aging pigment. What caught his attention was the marginalia, small notes in a different hand, written in what appeared to be Greek, but with syntax that made no grammatical sense. As he examined a specific passage under magnification, he noticed something impossible. The ink shimmered slightly, as if still wet. He dabbed a corner of the parchment. The mark it left on the linen swab was not brown, it was crimson. Shaken, Del Toro conducted a chemical test using reagents he had brought for ink analysis. The sample reacted not like iron or vegetable dye, but like hemoglobin, blood. He performed the test again with a second swab. Same result. The Vatican was contacted immediately. The codex was secured and transported under supervision to Rome, where further testing confirmed the presence of human blood, still biologically active in trace amounts despite the document's age. The origins of the marginalia remain unclear. Radiocarbon dating placed the manuscript in the 10th century, but the script style resembled 5th century Syrian liturgical forms. Theologians were unable to translate the annotations. A few phrases, when deciphered, formed fragmented warnings. He walks where the word is twisted, and Scripture speaks when the tongue is false. The manuscript was sealed within the Vatican Apostolic Archive and categorized under Doctrina Prohibita. It is no longer available to scholars. Del Toro later remarked in a rare personal letter, "The ink on that page was never meant to write truth. It bleeds because the lie still breathes." In 1984, in a small village outside Krakow, a 6-year-old girl named Magdalena stunned her parish priest during catechism by reciting a list of names, none of them from her class, none from her family. She spoke them slowly, as if reading from memory. When asked who these people were, she replied, "They live under the church." The priest assumed she was playing, perhaps mimicking language she'd overheard. But when he pressed her, she grew silent, then whispered, "They asked me to say them out loud." Days later, the parish held a funeral mass for a local farmer. During the homily, Magdalena stood suddenly, pointed at the coffin, and said, "He doesn't want to go down there with the others." The room fell into uneasy silence. Her parents apologized, blaming the interruption on a child's misunderstanding of death. But the priest was unsettled. That evening he retrieved parish burial records from centuries past. Many of the names she'd spoken did not match recent deaths, but they did appear in records from the 17th and 18th centuries, individuals interred beneath the chapel in long-forgotten crypts sealed during structural renovations. What disturbed the priest more was that several of those names had been associated with individuals excommunicated or denied full rights at death. According to archived correspondence, their remains had been stored without full sacramental closure. Magdalena should not have known any of this. Her family was not historically connected to the parish. They had moved there only a year earlier, and the girl could barely read. When Vatican officials were discreetly informed, a local bishop visited the site under the guise of routine inspection. A private mass of absolution was held, not for the living, but for the unidentified dead beneath the floor. The girl was never questioned directly. The bishop believed it best not to interfere. After the ceremony, Magdalena never spoke the names again. The church labeled the incident posthumous spiritual sensitivity, an expression rarely used, almost never explained, but some priests still speak of her in hushed tones, because sometimes the dead do not rise. They whisper. And when someone finally hears them, they ask for only one thing: remembrance. In a modest basilica in Avignon, a reliquary containing the hand of Saint Agrippina, an early Christian martyr known for healing the sick, had drawn quiet pilgrims for centuries. The hand, delicately preserved in a glass case lined with silver, had become a symbol of mercy and intercession. Priests would often bring it forth on feast days to bless the ill and troubled. But in the spring of 1974, during a rite intended to comfort a woman suspected of spiritual affliction, something changed. The hand would not move. Normally, when lifted, the relic rested weightlessly in its gilded cradle. But on that afternoon, as Father Leonard attempted to raise it for the blessing, it would not lift. The reliquary remained rooted to the table, though nothing visibly restrained it. He tried again. It held fast. 2 deacons attempted to assist. Nothing. Then, without warning, the glass fogged from the inside. A faint cracking sound followed. A hairline fracture appeared along the edge of the container, thin but unmistakable. The woman, seated silently in front of the altar, began to weep, not out of fear. She whispered, "She knows what I did." The woman's confession followed hours later. It was not criminal, but profound. A series of desecrations committed during her youth, including sacrilege within a chapel and acts of blasphemy performed in secret. She had never confessed. She believed time had cleansed her, but as she put it, the saint did not forget. After her admission and the sacrament of reconciliation, the reliquary lifted without resistance. The crack in the glass remained. A quiet reminder. The Vatican reviewed the case and found no natural explanation for the relic's behavior. The temperature of the basilica had been stable. The reliquary was undamaged before the rite. But what puzzled theologians was not the resistance. It was the implied will, the refusal to bless. Saints are venerated for mercy, but in this case, mercy waited until truth was spoken. No official miracle was declared. The event was not broadcast, but those who tend to relics understand something few speak aloud, that even the remains of the holy may carry a memory, and in rare moments, that memory chooses to speak through silence. Inside one of the oldest seminaries in Rome is a small guest room at the end of a quiet corridor, used only when all others are occupied. Known among the students as La Stanza Calda, the warm room, it is famous not for its comfort but for its unsettling consistency. Regardless of season, weather, or ventilation, the room is always warm, stifling, at times unbearably so. Thermometers placed inside have registered temperatures well above the building's ambient climate, even in the dead of winter. The heating system bypasses that floor entirely. No one can explain it. In 1993, a young seminarian named Paolo was assigned the room during a crowded academic conference. He noted the heat immediately but said nothing. By the second night, he began experiencing sleep disturbances, vivid dreams of figures watching him from the corners of the room. On the third night, he woke to find all the candles on his desk lit, though he had not lit them. Their wax had not burned down. The flame, he said, gave no heat, and yet the room remained oppressively warm. He reported the incident. A visiting priest, curious rather than alarmed, decided to spend the night there himself. At 2:11 a.m., he was heard calling for help. When others arrived, they found him collapsed on the floor, his skin flushed as if from sun exposure. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors diagnosed severe dehydration, despite his water intake being normal. He later described feeling watched, not by one thing, but by many, crowded and silent. The seminary petitioned the diocese for a spiritual cleansing. A rite was performed with minimal attention, a quiet affair held just before dawn. But the warmth persisted. The room was sealed shortly after and has not been assigned since. It remains unlocked, though no one chooses to stay there. Not out of fear, but because the heat is not natural. It presses inward, as if trying to keep something alive that should have faded long ago. In the archives, the file is labeled Persistent Atmospheric Disturbance. But to the few who have felt it, the truth is simpler. Some rooms do not go cold because something inside them refuses to die. In 1959, during restoration efforts beneath a decommissioned cathedral in northern Italy, workers broke through a crumbling section of foundation and uncovered an unexpected chamber. It was small, square, and empty, save for a single bronze bell suspended from the ceiling by a rusted iron chain. There were no markings, no inscriptions, and no mechanism to ring it. The room had no purpose, no altar, no seating, and yet the bell showed signs of use. Its edge was worn thin in one place, as if struck repeatedly. Curious, the lead restorer noted the anomaly and reported it to the local diocese. They dispatched a church historian to inspect the space. He arrived the following day and, according to his journal, felt a great pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm. That evening, while photographing the chamber, the historian heard the bell sound once, soft, low, and mournful, but there had been no wind, no movement, and no visible cause. The Vatican was informed, and a team of archivists and exorcists arrived within the week. They found no physical means for the bell to ring. The chain had rusted solid. Yet during their inspection, the bell rang again, this time twice. An assistant fainted. One priest dropped to his knees and began the litany of the saints. A preliminary rite was performed immediately. That night, the chamber was sealed again with bricks and mortar. The restoration was halted, and the blueprints of the crypt were edited to omit the chamber entirely. Later research uncovered a possible connection. A 14th century chronicle referenced the bell that marked refusal, used by monks in extreme cases to symbolically sever the soul of a heretic from the living church. No physical bell was ever found. Until now. If the artifact beneath the cathedral was indeed this relic, its use had likely been ceremonial once. But the bell ringing without touch or wind suggested something else, something still active. The case remains classified under sonus non causatus, a sound without cause, and the chamber remains untouched, because in the Church's long memory, the sound of a bell is not always a call to prayer. Sometimes it tolls for those who never left. In the heart of Palermo, an old Jesuit church stands with faded frescoes and a worn confessional booth tucked beneath the choir loft. For decades it had fallen into quiet disuse. The parish priest, Father Emilio, preferred hearing confessions face to face in the main nave, but one Lenten Friday in 1987, a woman insisted on using the old booth. She said she wanted to confess where her grandmother had. Out of courtesy, Father Emilio agreed. What followed was a confession unlike any he had received. The moment he entered, he felt the air change. Cold, then still, then silent, as if the sounds of the city had been sucked out of the stone. He heard breathing on the other side, then a voice, soft, feminine, whispering. But the words made no sense. Not gibberish, but a language he couldn't place, not Italian, not Latin. The voice grew louder, cycling through rhythms like liturgical chant, and then, in perfect Italian, it said, "You do not know me, you cannot forgive me." Father Emilio, shaken but composed, asked for clarification. The voice replied with names he recognized. 3 women from the 1600s, executed for witchcraft during the Spanish Inquisition, long since absolved by the Church. Then silence. He opened the door. No one was there. He searched the nave. No woman had entered. The sacristan confirmed it. He had seen no one pass. The priest returned to the confessional, touched the kneeler. It was cold, wet with condensation. He reported the incident to the diocesan office. No further investigation followed, but that booth was never used again. Years later, Father Emilio wrote in a private letter, "I have heard sorrow in many forms, but this was something that did not come seeking forgiveness. It came to be heard, and when I failed to understand, it left." The Church teaches that all who seek grace can receive it. But what happens when something lost to time returns? Not to repent, but to remind. The confessional remains in place, unmarked and untouched, because not every voice that enters that wooden box belongs to the living. Some come simply to speak, even if no one is left to listen. In 1965, in a cloistered convent near Lyon, Sister Hélène began to experience episodes of automatic writing, texts written in her sleep without conscious awareness. The first notes were found tucked beneath her pillow, lines of Latin prayer written backward in a neat, steady hand. She denied writing them. Her sisters assumed fatigue or stress, but as the episodes continued, the messages changed. They grew longer, more complex, and increasingly disturbing. Not prayers, but warnings. Not praise, but questions. Do they still kneel if the altar is empty? One note asked. Another simply read, I remember the fire. Sister Hélène was well educated but had no known history of mental illness. She was calm, soft-spoken, and known for her devotion, yet the messages persisted. She would wake to find pages scattered across her cell, sometimes dozens of them, all written during the night, all in her hand but with a tone that was not hers. She began fasting, believing the episodes were a test. Her health declined, but her spiritual clarity never wavered. The Mother Superior contacted the local bishop, who in turn reached out to Rome. A Jesuit linguist was sent to examine the writings. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Some of the phrases matched medieval curses, verbatim invocations recorded during witch trials of the 14th century. Others quoted apocryphal texts not available in French translation. Still more included references to theological errors long since condemned by the Church. Sister Hélène insisted she had never read any such works. She said the words came to her as whispers in the dark. An exorcism was considered but ultimately denied. There were no signs of possession, no voice changes, no violence, no aversion to the sacred. But the Vatican requested that the writings be sealed and transferred to Rome. The original pages now reside in a restricted section of the Archivum Secretum. Sister Hélène lived for another 20 years, never again writing in her sleep. She passed peacefully, surrounded by her sisters. But the case remains unresolved, because in the quietest hours, even the faithful can become vessels for memories that refuse to fade. And when the past wants to be written again, it finds a hand to hold the pen. At a small mountain chapel near Cortina d'Ampezzo, nestled deep in the Dolomites, there stands a stone altar barely large enough for one priest to celebrate Mass. The chapel, built in the 1700s by shepherds, was restored in the early 1990s after decades of abandonment. During the restoration, workers discovered an unusual candle set in a brass sconce behind the altar, completely untouched by wax drippings or smoke marks. They assumed it was decorative, but when the parish priest relit it for the reopening ceremony, he noticed something strange. The wick burned with no scent, no flicker. The flame held still, even as wind swept through the open door. He tried to extinguish it, once, twice, with breath and with water. It would not go out. Thinking it a trick of some sort, perhaps a hidden gas line, he removed the candle from its mount. It remained lit. He covered it with a metal dish. Still, the glow seeped out around the edges. Disturbed, he brought it to the sacristy and placed it in a sealed glass box. The flame never dimmed. Word spread quickly, and the diocesan bishop arrived to witness it firsthand. He, too, attempted to extinguish the flame with holy water. It hissed, but remained. A theologian from Rome suggested a symbolic reading. Perhaps the flame represented divine endurance, but another whispered what others feared. What if it isn't holy? One night, a visiting monk sat alone before the flame. He prayed silently for hours, then later wrote in his journal, "That light does not warm, it watches." He refused to return to the chapel again. Eventually, the Vatican ordered the candle transferred. During transport, inside a sealed crate, the flame was said to have flared once, illuminating the entire container before it finally extinguished. When the box was opened in Rome, the candle sat blackened, spent. But the glass had not cracked, and the wick showed no burn. It was filed away and forgotten by most, but among those who witnessed it, the question lingered, because light is not always a comfort. Sometimes it is a question, a presence, and sometimes what burns without consuming is not a miracle, but a warning. In the countryside outside Naples, an abandoned Carmelite convent stood in disrepair after decades of silence. The land had been purchased by a developer in 1999 who planned to convert the site into a retreat center. During excavation, workers uncovered an old stone well beneath what had once been the cloister garden. The well was dry, lined with volcanic rock, and appeared unused for centuries. But when one worker leaned over to inspect it, he heard a sound, faint, unmistakable, a voice echoing upward, repeating the same 3 Latin words, "Audi me iterum," hear me again. Work halted. Locals were called in, believing the voice might belong to someone trapped or a prankster hiding below. But the well was only 12 meters deep, its bottom in full view, empty, no debris, no speaker, no signs of recent disturbance. The voice continued for 2 more days, always at twilight, always the same phrase, spoken in a dry, unbroken cadence. Audi me iterum. The diocese was notified. A small team of clerics arrived to investigate, accompanied by an audio technician. Recordings were made, capturing the voice clearly. Experts confirmed no hidden electronics, no radio interference. One linguist noted the pronunciation was archaic, more consistent with late Roman than ecclesiastical Latin, but no match could be found for the speaker's identity. The historical records of the convent revealed a potential lead. In 1741, a nun named Sister Calpurnia was confined to the garden after a mental collapse. Her writings, preserved in fragments, described a voice in the stones and a thirst that comes not from the body. She died in isolation, never returned to the chapel, and was buried near the garden well, her grave now lost beneath the roots of the long-abandoned orchard. The well was resealed quietly, a stone cross placed above it. The recordings were archived and withheld from public release. The Church made no declaration, but those who heard the voice remember it vividly, not pleading, not commanding, but remembering, as if some part of a soul had never stopped speaking, as if the silence that followed was not peace, but interruption. At the Pontifical Gregorian University, one of the Vatican's most prestigious theological libraries, an obscure medieval manuscript known as De Clamore Obscuro, on the cry of darkness, had long been stored in the restricted archives. Written in the late 1200s by a Cistercian monk, the text was believed to be a series of reflections on the silence of God in times of suffering. Its pages were faded, brittle, and largely untranslated. For centuries, it had gathered dust, too damaged for public display, too cryptic for casual study. Until 2006, when a doctoral student named Luca Mariani received special permission to examine it for his dissertation on mysticism and silence. He worked alone, transcribing the Latin passages slowly, often squinting under the dim light of the manuscript reading room. One night, while copying a section from the middle of the codex, he noticed something strange. A line of text that hadn't been there the day before. It was written in fresh ink, modern ink. The handwriting matched the ancient script perfectly, yet the sentence was unmistakably new. It read, "You see now, but will you listen?" Assuming it was a prank, he alerted the librarian. Security was called and footage reviewed. No one had entered the room but Luca. No pens or ink were permitted in the archive. The page itself showed no signs of damage or overwriting. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more lines appeared, each one responding obliquely to sections Luca had translated aloud to himself. One phrase quoted a question he had written in his notebook, but in Latin. "Why is this silence louder than a scream?" The Vatican took possession of the manuscript. Luca was reassigned to a different project. He never spoke publicly about it again, but his private journal, leaked years later, contained one final note. It was not a book. It was listening. And once it began, it wanted to be heard again. The manuscript is now sealed in a temperature-controlled chamber beneath the Archivum Secretum. No further additions have been reported, but those who catalog the Church's most unusual relics agree some texts are not written once. Some are waiting to resume the conversation. Father Marco D'Alessio was known among his peers for his quiet dedication and reluctance to speak of his work. Assigned to the Diocese of Naples, he had performed dozens of exorcisms with a meticulous approach that earned him respect. Yet, behind closed doors, Father Marco carried a burden few understood. During one particularly violent case in 1982, he claimed to have heard voices, not from the possessed, but from the darkness itself. The case involved a young man from the outskirts of the city, exhibiting classic signs of possession. Sudden violent outbursts, aversion to holy objects, and knowledge of secret things he should not have known. During the rite, Father Marco recited prayers, his voice steady, while the man screamed curses in tongues no one recognized. But midway through, the priest reported hearing whispers, faint, layered, coming not from the boy, but from the corners of the room. At first he thought it was his imagination. Then the whispers grew distinct. They spoke in Latin, ancient and disjointed, warning him to stop. They named his family, his friends, places he had never mentioned. The priest felt a cold presence pressing against him, trying to force silence. He broke the rite early and fled the house. He refused to speak publicly of the event, but wrote extensively in his private journal, which later was examined by church officials. The journal detailed nights of torment, voices echoing through his mind, and a fear that the darkness had followed him beyond the possessed. He sought refuge in fasting and prayer, but the whispers persisted until he took a leave of absence. The Vatican quietly reassigned Father Marco to a monastery far from Naples. His case became a cautionary tale within exorcist circles, that sometimes the exorcist risks becoming the target. That in confronting evil, one may hear not just the cries of the possessed, but the secrets the shadows guard. In a humble chapel nestled in the Tuscan hills, a wooden crucifix revered for its age and craftsmanship began exhibiting phenomena that puzzled both clergy and laity. Parishioners first noticed during the winter of 1963 that red droplets appeared on the base of the cross, droplets that seemed to shimmer like fresh blood. At first, the priest, Father Giacomo, suspected natural causes, condensation mixing with dust or paint, yet no explanation fit. The droplets were warm to the touch and left no residue. Word spread quickly. Pilgrims journeyed to the chapel, hoping to witness the miracle. Scientific tests were conducted discreetly. Samples taken from the crucifix were analyzed in nearby laboratories. The substance was confirmed to be human blood, type AB, a rare blood group. No injuries were found on any individuals associated with the church. Father Giacomo maintained a cautious approach, emphasizing prayer and discernment. He invited Vatican officials to observe. A team of theologians and forensic experts arrived, documenting the occurrences but offering no definitive conclusions. The bleeding happened intermittently, often during moments of communal prayer or heightened emotion, but never in isolation. Skeptics proposed explanations ranging from hidden mechanisms to psychological suggestion. Believers saw it as a sign of Christ's enduring sacrifice, a reminder that suffering is ongoing. The Church declared the phenomenon worthy of veneration, but stopped short of calling it a miracle. The crucifix remains in the chapel, encased in glass, a focal point for reflection on pain and redemption. But among those who have studied it, the question remains unanswered. How can a symbol of death bleed life? And what is the message carried in each drop? In the Vatican's treasury, among relics rarely seen by outsiders, was a cloak believed to have belonged to Saint Francis of Assisi. The fabric, simple and worn, had been preserved for centuries, wrapped carefully in velvet and stored under strict conditions. Yet, in the summer of 1924, during a routine inventory, the cloak vanished without trace. No sign of theft, no breach of security. The disappearance baffled Vatican officials and sparked one of the Church's most secret investigations. The cloak was not just a garment, it was a symbol of humility and devotion, a tangible connection to a saint who had renounced worldly wealth. Its loss was felt deeply, not merely as a theft, but as an ominous absence. Months later, a series of letters arrived at the Apostolic Palace, unsigned, written in shaky handwriting, claiming the cloak was not lost but moved. The writer warned that the cloak's presence could ignite darkness where light should reign. Despite increased security measures, other relics began showing signs of disturbance: small tears, displaced coverings, faint scorch marks. Some whispered that the cloak had been taken by a force that sought to pervert its holiness. Others believed it had been hidden deliberately, a protective act by those who feared what might happen if it remained. No official statement was ever made. The cloak never reappeared. Some speculate it was hidden deep within the catacombs beneath Rome, or perhaps transported to a secret vault. Others say it vanished into legend, part of a larger spiritual struggle between preservation and loss. For centuries, relics have been battlegrounds of faith and doubt. The disappearance of St. Francis's cloak reminds us that even the most sacred objects are not immune to the unseen forces that roam in the shadows of belief. The Vatican's Sistine Chapel is renowned for its breathtaking frescoes and the sacred ceremonies held beneath Michelangelo's masterpiece. But in the early 1960s, during late-night rehearsals for a solemn mass, the choir experienced something that has since been hushed into silence. Choir members reported hearing whispers, faint voices singing in harmony, but not matching the music being performed. These whispers seemed to emanate from the chapel walls themselves, invisible yet unmistakably present. The phenomenon began gradually. A soprano heard her name called softly as she practiced alone. A bass claimed to have heard a duet from an unseen partner. The entire choir reported moments where their voices were momentarily overtaken by a mysterious, ethereal chorus that faded as quickly as it appeared. The sound was described as both beautiful and unsettling, a melody that was neither fully human nor divine. The choir director sought counsel from the Vatican's archivist and a team of clerics versed in sacred music. Attempts to record the whispers failed. Microphones captured only silence. Scholars hypothesized that the acoustics of the chapel and the intense spiritual atmosphere might produce auditory illusions, but no explanation satisfied the participants. One night during a midnight mass, the whispers rose in clarity, blending with the choir's voices to form a haunting counterpoint. Many present claimed to feel a chill and a sense of presence beyond the physical. The event was never officially acknowledged but led to a temporary suspension of rehearsals. The whispers ceased shortly after, but stories linger. The Vatican keeps no public record of the incident. To those who were there, the voices were a reminder that the chapel is more than stone and paint. It is a meeting place where the seen and unseen brush close, singing their eternal hymns, sometimes together, sometimes apart. In a centuries-old church in Florence, priests and staff began reporting an unnerving presence in the sacristy, a narrow, cluttered room where vestments and sacred vessels are kept. The first incidents were small: misplaced keys, flickering lights, faint footsteps when no one was present. But over time, the manifestations grew more disturbing. Shadows moved independently of their sources, doors slammed shut without cause, and objects were found broken or mysteriously shifted. One night, Father Matteo stayed late to prepare for a morning mass. As he folded a chasuble, he felt a cold breath against his neck and heard a whisper in Latin, "Reda rationem vitae tuae," give an account of your life. Spinning around, he saw nothing, but the room's temperature dropped sharply. He lit a candle, but the flame warped, bending toward a darkened corner where a shape seemed to coalesce briefly. A silhouette neither fully human nor entirely absent. The incidents led to several informal investigations, but no source was identified. Security cameras captured brief flickers of movement, blurs, and shifting darkness, but no clear figure. Parishioners who entered the sacristy reported feelings of deep unease, as if the room itself held a judgment. A retired exorcist was called in. He performed a discreet blessing, followed by a short rite of purification. The disturbances lessened, but never vanished completely. Father Matteo later confided that the shadow felt less like a threat and more like a reminder, a spectral guardian or accuser tied to the Church's long history of sins and secrets. In sacred places, the past never fully fades. Sometimes it lingers in shadows, waiting silently to be reckoned with. Deep within the Vatican's vaults lies a final file, numbered and sealed, titled simply Silentium Sacrum, Sacred Silence. It contains no photographs, no detailed reports, only a few sheets of parchment filled with sparse notes and dates. The file represents the Church's most guarded secret. The moments when silence itself is the most profound sign of divine presence or absence. These entries chronicle encounters where words failed, where prayers were whispered into voids, and where the presence of the sacred was felt not in noise or spectacle, but in quiet, so deep it unsettled the soul. Monks who spoke only after years of silence, relics that radiated a mute power, and exorcisms ended, not with confrontation, but with a stillness that spoke volumes. The file captures the paradox of faith, that sometimes, to face the divine or the demonic, one must first endure the silence between. It is said that this file is opened only when all other answers have been exhausted, that it holds the truth that many fear, that in the end, the greatest mysteries of the Church are beyond speech, beyond understanding, beyond time. As the vault doors close, the silence resumes, reminding us that faith is not always declared. Sometimes it is quietly held, in the spaces between words, in the stillness of the soul, in the sacred unknown. This marks the end of the Exorcist Files of the Vatican. Thank you for joining this journey into the hidden and the holy, the whispered and the feared. If you found this story compelling, Please consider liking and subscribing to explore more with us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, because across the silence we form a community.